This video looks at the role of the central nervous system and neurotransmitters in explaining human behaviour. You need to be able to describe the parts of the central nervous system, describe the role of the central nervous system in regard to behaviour, and describe the role of neurotransmitters. Now, the central nervous system is one part of the nervous system and is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the biological approach focuses specifically on the brain and how this controls human behaviour. So the central nervous system is part of the nervous system, and it allows us to send information via the spinal cord to our brain. The brain will then process this information and send a message to our body. So, for example, our eyes will send a message about a car coming towards us if we're trying to cross a road. The brain will then look and process how far away the car is and send a message back to us telling us whether or not to cross the road. And it's the neurons within the brain that pass the messages along what we call neurotransmitters. Now, these are released at what we call synaptic gaps and then are picked up and absorbed by receptor sites. You need to know the structure of a neuron. You may be asked to label a neuron in your exam, but you also need to know the function of the neuron and what it is and what it does. Now, neurons are nerve cells, and they're passing the information around the body and around the brain. At one end, they have dendrites. From the nucleus, there is a long extension called an axon, which reaches to an axon terminal. The axon terminal is one end of the neuron that will reach to the dendrite of another neuron, and the gap between them is what we call the synapse. Now, on one side, from the postsynaptic cell, are receptors of a certain shape that are prepared to receive the neurotransmitter once it's been released across the synaptic gap from the presynaptic cell. The neurotransmitter will only be absorbed if it fits specifically into the receptor site. If you look at the picture of the neuron on the screen, you can see we've got the cell body containing the nucleus with the genetic information and dendrites coming off from that. Now, it's the dendrites from here that will link to the axon terminals of the postsynaptic neuron to create a synaptic gap in which the neurotransmitter is crossed. So, as mentioned, the cell body here contains the nucleus and the genetic material in the middle, and this is attached to the dendrites, which receive messages to trigger the action potential within the cell. Now, attached to the cell body is the axon, and this is what passes electrical impulse toward the axon terminal. And it's at the top of the terminal that we have an axon hillcock, which is where the nerve impulse is triggered from. You can see the red part of the cell here. We have rolls of myelin sheath, which acts as like an insulator, and it's the gaps in between the myelin sheath, which is the nodes of Ranvier. At the end of the axon are the axon terminals, and at the end of these are what we call terminal buttons. Now, these pass the nerve impulses from the cell body to the parts of the body that they control or they activate. And inside there are what we call vesicles, which hold the neurotransmitters ready for the next stage. Now, just remember, the neurotransmitters that we're talking about are the chemical messengers that act between the neurons that pass the messages on, and it's these that allow our brain to process thoughts and memories. Now, common neurotransmitters that you will have come across on your course, specifically dopamine and serotonin. Now, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's been related to emotion and cognitive functions, as well as being linked to movement. It's associated with reinforcement in learning, but it also plays a role in creating dependency, such as addictions, which is looked on the drug video. Dopamine is also suggested to be linked to the hormone regulation, such as the control of women's menstrual cycle. Serotonin is what we call the mood neurotransmitter because it's associated with controlling mood, particularly within the limbic system. Now, in order for the neurotransmitters to be released from the presynaptic cell and cross the synaptic gap, an action potential has to take place. An action potential is an electrical charge that happens within the cell body. So the action potential travels along the axons via the axon hillcock, and it is the action potential that releases the neurotransmitter stored at the terminal of the axon. Now, the myelin sheath, which is wrapped across the axon that I just showed you in red, and these are the breaks within the myelin sheath, which are called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, the electrical signal literally jumps from node to node, and it is this that speeds up the action potential. If we just look at this basic diagram, you can see at the top in yellow here, This is the presynaptic cell, and these are the vesicles carrying the neurotransmitters that we just talked about. Now this here is what we call the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, and these black dots here are the neurotransmitters. Now they're only released once the action potential has taken place to release the neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap. Now these here are what we refer to as the receptor sites. Now if the neurotransmitter will fit perfectly on top of the receptor site, then it will be absorbed. If it doesn't fit, it will be blocked. Now I've been talking a lot about the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. Now the presynaptic neuron is the one that we've been looking at the top that carries the vesicles with the neurotransmitter in, and the postsynaptic neuron is the neuron at the bottom with the receptor sites, which is receiving the message. I want you to think of the receptors a bit like a lock and a key, because the receptor site is the lock and it will only fit a certain key, and the key is the neurotransmitter. So if the neurotransmitter fits perfectly onto the receptor site, then it will be absorbed, just like a key, if it fits perfectly within a door, will open the door. If it doesn't fit onto the receptor site, then it won't be absorbed, just like the wrong key will not open the door. Now, after the transmission of their neurotransmitter from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell, any neurotransmitters that are left within the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft will be reabsorbed by the presynaptic neuron, and this process is called reuptake. Now, I want to just demonstrate a previous exam question on the old specification where students had to label the missing keywords from a diagram of a neuron, but also from diagrams of the neurotransmitter or from the synapse.